Welcome to the podcast editing and support show. My name is Dave. Are you ready? Are you ready? Let's go. We're going to start the episode right now. Happy to have you here. Let's do this. Hey, welcome back to the podcast. Glad to have you here. Today, talking about how to set clear deliverables for you when you're sitting down with a podcast host. You're a podcast editor. You want to grow your business. You want to meet with new podcasters. But I think having a finish line is always important. And I don't think we do that often enough when we sit down with a potential new podcast host. What does good look like? What does success look like? How do we know we met our goal? How do we know we're on target? These are all clear deliverables that we need to discuss in advance of signing any kind of contract or long-term agreement with a host and a podcast editor, is understanding what are the deliverables. So I have 4 for you and some examples of each as well. So excited to be here with you on the show. And if you're thinking about starting your own podcast editing service, or if you have one, we're here to help you grow that and grow the idea and grow your business and connect you with great podcasters. So that's what the show's all about. Glad to have you here. Let's start with a specific output as a clear deliverable. What is that and why do we need it? A specific output is something that can be measurable, something that can be time-bound, something that can be a to-do list item. It is a specific output that you're hoping for and working towards as an editor. Something that's clearly defined what the client is going to receive. Example, a completed edited audio file, or completed show notes, or a social media post with frequency and concise and meaningful things that we're going to work towards. These are all lined out and outlined when we meet with our podcast host for the first time and kind of walk through setting up our business together, that working relationship. What are the specific outputs that the editor is going to provide, the support person is going to provide, and that the host is expecting? That's something we need to have that conversation right at the beginning of our time together. Another thing that we need to have as a clear deliverable is the standard for quality for what is being created and received. There needs to be a baseline understanding about what good is. So one of the things I ask for when I meet with somebody who doesn't have a podcast and they're thinking of starting a podcast and they want to work with an editor is I ask them to do a couple things. First, go on to their listening app for podcasts, because as a podcaster, you should be a podcast listener. That just goes together. I really think you should. And when you pull up your podcast app of choice, Apple, Spotify, Amazon, whatever, as you scroll through and look at the myriad of images that you're going to see on a podcast app, I ask them, just around the artwork, what stands out to you? And when you see something, as you scroll through images after image after image, pictures with podcast images with people on it, people podcast images, words, the colors, the feel, the tone. When they stop at something and go, hang on, I like that, then screenshot it or make note of it and send me a list of 5 cover arts that really catch your eye and tell me why. Could be the font, the color, the imagery, the feel, the tone, everything about it, and just tell me why it sticks out to you. That's a good indication for me around imagery and what the podcast feels like, which will then lead into the audio editing and all of that as well. But it helps me to understand what good looks like to a podcast host, especially if they don't have a show yet. The other part is to listen to podcasts and to come up with an idea of what good sound is to the podcast host so that we have an understanding. Share the episodes back and forth and go, this is what I like. I like this for this reason, and maybe I don't like this for this reason. And that kind of helps to kind of give some parameters. Think of when you drive down the highway, right? The interstate. You're going along, and then there's these guardrails, usually where there's something that could keep you on the road and keep you from going off the road and going into something dangerous. There's guardrails. They keep you on the road. When you have this conversation with your podcaster, they're guardrails. What looks good, what sounds good, all of these things are things that you should have as part of the conversation, because then it's going to help you to have a better idea, and you'll get into the head and into the heart of the podcaster and know what resonates with them. And that you can then duplicate and replicate for them through your podcast editing. So Establish what are the quality standards, expectations for the quality of the audio, the show note length, the number of social media posts. All of those things are things that we can offer through editing and podcast support. Establish quality standards. The next one is to define the timelines. So you and I work differently. I work one way, you work a different way. I might be organized, you might be disorganized. I might have attention to detail, you might be like, meh, good enough. We all have these things and these filters that we put over ourselves to kind of guide and direct us as we do things. So understanding that we're two different people, I need to understand what you value, and you need to understand what I value. We need to define timelines. Specifically when it comes around the deliverables and when they're supposed to be done and complete. We need to understand what we need to do by a certain point in time to meet a goal. So if your podcast goes out on Monday at 6 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, then what does it take? Reverse engineer that to make that happen. I need your files then by Thursday so that I can meet a Monday morning deadline, for example. And that has to be mapped out. So if you're late on Thursday and I don't get them until Sunday night at midnight for a Monday morning release, it might not happen. And it's nothing to do with me. It's all about you. And for the podcast host listening, understand that your podcast editor probably has other shows they're working on, and they're going to work their calendar around to meet all the different various release dates and times. So if you miss your window, you might have to miss a week or be delayed or not meet your goal because you didn't deliver the files to the editor on time. So keep that in mind. Some of it comes back to you being on time and being focused on meeting deadlines to your podcast editor. Side note, for you, if you're not a very disciplined person as a host, working with an editor will make you more disciplined because now you have a due date. You have a time and a date where your podcast has to be recorded and submitted so that you can have a release date met as the editor does the work behind the scenes. So working with an editor might make you better at meeting deadlines. So it might be an advantage to you. And then the last part of all this is, as far as a clear deliverable, outline a revision policy. This is very important for both editors and podcasters. So this has happened to me many times. I get the file from the host. There's really no clear direction as far as what they want for the episode. I go in, I do my work, and I give it back to them. And then they come back and go, wait a minute, can we do this, this, and this? Oh, and this, and maybe this, and oh, if we have time, can we do this, this, and this? Those are all additional things on top of a finished edited podcast. Keep that in mind. We need some kind of policy agreement between the host and the editor about how many revisions are possible in a timeline and clearly define how many rounds of revisions are allowed or permitted. Because every time there's a new request or an extra change or a little additional this and that, detracts from the time for other editing clients and also then impacts the deadline. So you got to keep that in mind. So some examples of deliverables for a weekly podcast package. Here's some examples for you. A fully edited 60-minute podcast episode delivered 3 days before the release. There you go. How about this one? A 500-word SEO-optimized show note with timestamps delivered 2 days before the release. Very specific, with actionable, measurable things, and a time bound. How about this one? 5 social media posts per episode across Twitter, X, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Scheduled for a specific release day and for the week after the release goes live. Very measurable, very specific. What about this? A monthly performance report and strategy call with the editor. We don't talk about these things. We talk about we talk about us, silence, and music. And how do I get more listeners? That's all we get. So I'm telling you, these are examples where we can reach out to our podcaster and offer them something in addition to us and ums. We're so much more than that. By thoroughly addressing these things in conversation with your podcaster, you can create a really comprehensive project-based pricing structure that's really going to help you to reflect the value that you provide as an editor and support person to your podcast host while ensuring that you're profitable for yourself and for those you work with. Because if you're not profiting from this, and you're not making money for this, if you're just covering costs or hardly covering your costs, you're not going to be in business for long. You need to make money at this. And you need to not worry about asking for people to pay you for what you're worth. And as hosts, please don't nickel and dime your podcast editor. They're giving up time to do this for you and be a support for you. And as they add these additional things to support your podcast business, be generous. Support them because you wanted this working relationship to last. They're offering their best to you. And as podcast hosts, you need to pay for the services you're asking for. And I would say to a podcast host, the moment you think, I just like one more thing out of my editor, instead of coming with the ask, come with the ability to give first and say, listen, I love what you're doing. Here's a little extra. And what I'm thinking is, I'd like to use you more. What does it look like to add A, B, and C? How much would that cost? Can you do that without burying yourself and being stressed out and anxious? Is there any room in your calendar for me to add some more things? Because I really like working with you, and I'd love to work with you more and support you. That's what we can do from a podcast host perspective to encourage our editors. So I think that's one piece that's missing. There's just these add-ons and add-ons and add-ons without any kind of financial support for the editor in the ask to do extra. Think of it, figure out how you can do that, and have a working relationship between editor and host, between support person and podcaster. Thanks for listening to the Podcast Editing and Support Show. Visit us at podcasteditingandsupport.com, podcasteditingandsupport.com. We would love to help you find a great podcast editor, or if you want to hire us, we would love to work with you. Podcasteditingandsupport.com. Catch you on the next episode. Take care.